Hello, and welcome to the second of two Symbiotic Schoolyard training videos. If you haven't watched the first one, I recommend you go back and watch that one first, because that will help set you up for the restoration project. This video is a unit overview. We're going to do a lesson by lesson overview of the Schoolyard Habitat Restoration Unit. So this is going to familiarize you to the unit. And we're going to do a deep dive into lesson 3 and lesson 4, but both on how to prepare for those lessons and teach them. Lesson 3 and lesson 4 are really great lessons. And they also take a bit more prep and practice. So I'm going to try to set you up for success with those lessons, and we're going to spend extra time on those. So again, I'm Jannica Peterson. And there are two core components to Symbiotic Schoolyard. The first is the restoration project. The second is the Schoolyard Habitat Restoration Unit. So the first training video is on how to prepare for the restoration project. This video is on an overview of the Schoolyard Habitat Restoration Unit. So to begin, the Symbiotic Schoolyard unit can serve as your ecosystem unit. So it can take the place of your previous ecosystem unit. And I actually highly recommend this because the unit covers all of the middle school NGSS science standards related to ecosystems. So MS, LS2, 1 through 5, which are all the ecosystem standards. This unit covers them. So I really recommend that this serve as your ecosystem unit. And the focal science and engineering practices are listed here, as well as the focal cross-cutting concepts that are in this unit. This unit has everything you need to teach. So the goal here is that you're not doing any extra lesson planning on weekends. The unit includes a detailed teacher guide with 13 lesson plans, a student investigation notebook with all the student handouts, and that you print out at the very beginning and staple it together. And so you don't have to print, different worksheets every day. Students just have their notebook. And there's a PowerPoint for each lesson, and there are assessments and rubrics for grading those assessments. This unit has been reviewed and piloted by teachers. So thank you to all the teachers who gave me excellent feedback. It's in its 3rd year of being taught now. And so it's been through a lot of iterations, and I think it's a very usable now, but it's still not a perfect curriculum, and I value your feedback. So please feel free to email me at any time and be like, this part of this one lesson just didn't work that great in my classroom, and I changed it this way and it worked so much better. I would love to hear about any feedback like that to improve this. Okay, so the unit Pedagogy is, it's NGSS storyline driven. So as you may know, storylines, when we talk about NGSS storylines, we mean lesson sequences that guide students in developing their understanding of a phenomenon. And storylines are really the vehicle for teaching science content in an NGSS aligned classroom. So our storyline for the Symbiotic Schoolyard unit, or our driving question or our phenomenon, is how can we increase the biodiversity of our schoolyard? So that challenge, how are we going to increase the biodiversity? That's the storyline. And every lesson is a little piece of the story, a little answer, a little piece of the answer to that challenge. And all the lessons tie back to this challenge. So I've done my best to make each lesson student-centered. So each lesson has an investigation or activity that groups of 4 complete using step-by-step instructions in their notebooks. And this allows you as teacher to really be a guide on the side rather than a sage on the stage. So because those instructions for each activity investigation are written out in their notebooks, and you teach the groups, you teach your students to follow those step-by-step instructions, this frees you up as teacher to circulate and assist groups in completing the activity. and provide extra challenges, questioning, support, whatever each group needs from you. So let's get into the overview. Okay, again, our driving question or challenge is, how can we increase the biodiversity of our schoolyard? So students get this question on the very first day of the unit. I'm going to be quiet for just a couple minutes to let you read this overview of the unit to yourself. Okay, so this is let's go in, we're going to do a lesson by lesson overview. And lesson 1, you are defining a problem and introducing a challenge. So students watch 2 short videos and study statistics on biodiversity loss from the IUCN in order to find out about a problem, declining biodiversity. Your students then receive a challenge to increase the biodiversity of their schoolyard. So the problem they are presented with is declining biodiversity, and then they're given a challenge to increase the biodiversity of your schoolyard or nearby preserve. So if your restoration site is in a local park, for example, but most likely it'll be in your schoolyard. So I'm going to play this video challenge that students get. Remember, this is on lesson 1, on the first day of the unit. You play this video as a way to introduce them to their challenge.
Hello, student ecologists. My name is Yannicka, and I'm president of Act Now Science. We face a huge problem. Biodiversity is declining everywhere, including in your own community, due to human actions. But it's not too late. The mission of Act Now Science is to partner with middle school science students like you to help solve the biodiversity crisis. Act Now Science has a challenge for your class. Your challenge is to increase the biodiversity of your schoolyard. Pause the video and write down 3 big questions you have about your challenge. What do you need to know in order to complete your challenge? Now turn to your neighbor and share your questions, and then choose one question that you think is the biggest question, the biggest, most general question that needs to be answered in order to complete your challenge. Your questions, ideas, investigations, and hard work over the next few weeks are so important as you work to figure out how to increase the biodiversity of your own schoolyard. Good luck.
Okay, so by the way, hopefully by the time you show this video to your students, I've changed the name from Act Now Science to Symbiotic Schoolyard. I need to redo those videos and make it Symbiotic Schoolyard. I actually changed the name from Act Now Science to Symbiotic Schoolyard. I just want to, and let me point out something important. That video, that's not all of lesson 1, right? Check out the teacher guide. That's just one piece of lesson 1. And something that's really important is you want to let students figure out the challenge, which is to increase biodiversity. You want to let them figure it out themselves. So you know, as teacher, that students are going to be planting native plants as the solution to their challenge, but withhold this information. The lessons are going to slowly guide students toward the solution, and they're going to have more ownership if you let them figure it out. So, for example, I had a teacher one time call me up at the end of the school day, and he said he had just taught lesson one, and they'd done the launch video. Students got their challenge, and there's a part of lesson one where you and your students are brainstorming ideas about how they might increase biodiversity. And during that brainstorm session, apparently one of his students, this teacher who called me, one of his students suggested releasing his pet beetles in the schoolyard. And the teacher was like, and what I told the teachers, I said, that's great. Put that idea up on the idea board, on the driving question board. You create a driving question board in lesson one. So put up that idea. Can we release pet beetles to increase biodiversity? It's not a bad idea, right? And so you don't need to shoot that idea down. You don't need to say, no, we're going to plant native plants. You want to withhold that you're going to plant native plants, because students are going to be more invested in their challenge if you let them figure it out. So native plants will come up and they will be guided. There will be a point in the lesson where it's very likely they're going to bring up native plants themselves as the solution. The lessons will guide them towards that. Okay. So lesson 2 is an exciting one because students get to explore the UN Decade on Restoration website in order to find out how ecosystem restoration might help them with their challenge. And the purpose of lesson 2 is to connect the students' challenge and the work they're doing with a global movement. So biodiversity loss is a global problem, and we do need local and global solutions. And there is an exciting international movement happening right now through the UN Decade on Restoration that you and your students are now a part of. Okay, lesson 3. This is the plant identification lesson. And the way that I recommend you teach plant ID is through each two, teach two. Now, if you have another lesson that you have done before to teach native plant ID, you can use that lesson as long as the lesson teaches students, say, at least 6 native plants. But this is a really great way to teach. Each two teach you is an awesome way to teach native plants, but it takes a little setup and understanding how it works. So during each two teach two, students learn how to identify at least 6 native plants and 1 invasive plant. So before I teach you how to teach each two teach two, it's important to remind you of something we covered in the first training video, which is your restoration site versus your reference site. So your restoration site is again that degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystem in your schoolyard. Could be a lawn, could be gravel, could be covered in invasives, could be pavement if you're doing native container gardening. So that's your restoration site. Your reference ecosystem is a healthy ecosystem that you're using as a guide for coming up with a plant list for your restoration site. So ideally, you have a reference ecosystem in your schoolyard or within walking distance. And go back to the other video for more tips on that. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect reference ecosystem as long as there are at least 6, maybe you get away with 4 or 5 native plants in your reference ecosystem, it will work. Lesson 3 and lesson 4 take place in the reference ecosystem. So again, each two teach two takes place in your reference ecosystem. But what you want to do is go to that reference ecosystem, before you teach this lesson, scope it out and scope out the native plants that are there. And try to see if you can create kind of a trail through it. So if it's a really small clump, maybe the trail goes around the perimeter. If it's a larger area and you're able to kind of make a trail through it, do that. But you want it to be sort of somewhat linear so that students can follow a trail. It doesn't have to be an actual trail, but follow an obvious path through the reference ecosystem, and then they'll be stopping at plants along the way. So again, if it's a really small area, sometimes the best that works is like going around the perimeter. So I'm going to model for you how each two teach two works. Okay, so the first thing you do is you have your students gathered And, you know, at the beginning of the trail or the path that they're going to take, and you're going to send the first pair of students down the trail. Okay, so we're going to send these two students here down the trail. They should walk together, but I am just going to move them separately. And they're going to walk down the trail until they meet you. You are waiting for them at the first plant on the path or the trail. When they get to you, you as teacher are going to teach them about this plant. And I'll give you some tips and model how you might teach them about the plant, but that'll be the next slide. We'll get to that in a minute. So for now, I just want you to understand the pattern. So when the extra adult has released these two students, they're starting their stopwatch for 90 seconds. So you have 90 seconds to teach these students about their plant. At the end of the 90 seconds, you hand them their card and you tell them that they are now planting with their plant because they're the teachers of this plant. So they are going to stay with this plant for a long time and teach about this plant to their students. Okay, so a minute and a half has gone by. Ding, 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 or whatever your sound maker is. And your adult helper is going to release the next pair of students down the trail. Okay, so they're walking down the trail or the path. Here they come. And they're arriving at the first plant. Meanwhile, you've walked to the next plant. Okay, so here they are. They're going to learn about this plant from the student teachers for a minute and a half because your extra adult has set the clock for a minute and a half. So a minute and a half goes by, ding, 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 and the extra adult is releasing the next pair of students who are walking down the trail. But at the same time, these students also heard the bell or the sound maker. And they, see if I can get them to move together here. Okay, I can't. But they are also walking down the trail together. They're always staying with their pairs, okay? So these guys are walking down the trail to the next plant where, look, they meet you. While these pair who have just been released, they're walking, they are walking to this first pair of student teachers. So they're learning about this plant from these guys again. Meanwhile, this pair of students, they're getting assigned their plant. So now they're going to become teachers. So you teach these students about this plant. You hand them their card. You tell them to plant with their plant because now they're teachers. A minute and a half has gone by and your supporting adult makes the sound, ding, 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 and releases the next pair of students. So they're going to walk down the trail together. Meanwhile, these guys have also heard the bell. So they are also going to walk down the trail and come to this pair of students to learn about this plant. Okay, so everybody is walking down the trail unless you have a card and you've planted with your plant, unless you're student teacher. Okay. So now you're kind of waiting here. You've got a minute and a half. You're kind of observing how these students are doing teaching, maybe providing some feedback, but kind of hanging back a little. Okay, minute and a half has gone by. Ding, 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 ding. So they're going to release the next pair of students. But remember, these guys also heard the ding, ding, ding. So they are also walking down the trail. So these guys are moving down the trail to this plant where they meet you. These guys are walking down the trail to learn about their second plant. And this next pair is walking down the trail to learn about their first plant. And let me be really clear that when you teach a pair of students about a plant and you hand them this card, that means they plant with their plant. They stay with their plant. They become the teachers for that plant. If a pair of students has a card in their hand, that means they stay with their plant. If they don't have a card in their hand, that means they're walking down the path. Okay, so you're now teaching this pair about their plant, and you hand them the card. You say, okay, now you're the teachers of this plant. So they plant with their plant, and a minute and a half has gone by. So they hear ding, ding, ding. And your extra adult has released the next pair of students, and they are walking down the trail to learn about their first plant. These guys have also heard the bell, and so they're walking down the trail. So these guys are walking here. These guys are walking to this plant. They're just walking to the next plant on the trail. And this pair of students, which have just been released, are coming to learn about their first plant. You starting to see the pattern? And here you're just you're teaching about a plant and then hanging back for a minute. Teaching about a plant, hanging back for a minute. So you're hanging back here and you're watching to see how these students do teaching about their plant, maybe providing some feedback on their teaching, but sort of hanging back. Okay, a minute and a half has gone by. Ding, 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 ding. So that means they're going to release the next pair of students. And you probably have more than, you probably have 20 to 30 students in your class. So this goes on for longer than I'm showing here. But these guys are going to walk down the trail just like everybody else did. These guys also heard the bell. So they're walking down the trail. These guys come to you to learn about this plant. These guys go learn about their third plant. This pair comes to learn about their second plant. And these students who have just been released from the group come to learn about their first plant. So this continues. If you have 30 students, this continues 15 times, right? So now we're at the end, okay? When the supporting adult is standing all by themselves and they've released all the students, this is where they are going to walk through the path themselves and they're going to sweep the line. And it's important that you do your best to really make sure that your supporting adult understands their role here. This beginning part's pretty easy. They just have to release students every minute and a half, ring a bell, wait a minute and a half, ring the bell, wait a minute and a half, ring the bell. That's pretty easy. But this part, their role, it's not that hard, but if they understand it, it's going to work really well. If they don't understand it, it's not the end of the world, but the activity will kind of devolve. Okay, so they're standing all by themselves. You're at the end of the line. Depending how many students you have, you might be 15 plants in. So they are now going to walk down the trail after a minute and a half, and they're still making the sound, right? So they're still timing a minute and a half, okay? But they take their sound maker with them. Ding, 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 ding. And so these students, they all know the drill by now. They just walk down the line, right? So these students walk to these students walk to these students, and these students walk to this plant. Okay, so they all know the drill. But now, suddenly, there are no students to learn about this plant. But there is your supporting adult, and they're going to learn about this plant from this pair of students. Okay, but they're still timing a minute and a half. And actually, I recommend at this point that they switch to 1 minute, not a minute and a half. It just works out a little better. So now they're just timing 1 minute. And they're going to learn for 1 minute from these students about the plant. They're still timing a minute goes by, ding, 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 ding. Everybody knows the drill. They walk down the line. So these guys walk down. They walk down. Everybody's walking down the line. But look, now this supporting adult is going to release these students to walk down the line. So these students have taught about their plant probably many times by now, like 10 or 15 times. And now they are going to get to walk for the first time. They get to be students, not teachers. So now they become the students. The adult is releasing them after having learned about their plant. And now they are learning about the student. This supporting adult is now just going to hang out by this plant. They can just chill for a minute, keep on timing, but hang out for a minute. So a minute goes by, ding, 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 ding. And the pattern, as we know it, continues. But look, now these guys teach the supporting adult. They walk down the trail and learn about this plant from these two students. Okay, a minute and a half goes by. Ding, 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 ding. This adult now releases these students who have been teachers for a long time by now and have taught their plant many times. They're going to release these students down the line. Okay, so everybody moves down the line again. We know the pattern. I'm almost done. Like this, walk down the line. And remember, this adult is releasing these students who have been teachers many times now to learn about this. So this adult is sweeping the line. Hopefully this modeling helped and makes sense. There's also written instructions in the teacher guide in lesson 3. I'm going to model for you how you might teach plants. You want to teach them to teach. We're kind of doing two things in a minute and a half. You're teaching them about their plant, and then you are teaching them how to teach about their plant. So I want to model this for you because you kind of model for students how they're going to teach about their plant. Now, this is just how I do it, and I've taught this lesson many, many, many times. But if you'll make this your own as well. So this is just one way to do it, but it is a way that I've done a lot that works well. I'm going to use this potted plant instead of a native plant outside just to model it. Okay, so I'm the teacher. I'm in the reference ecosystem, and I have a pair of students coming down the trail to me, and I am now going to teach those students how to be teachers of their plant. So I'm putting on my teacher hat. Hello, I would like to introduce you to Douglas fir. What do you notice about Douglas fir? Yeah, touch the leaves. How do the leaves feel? Okay, and what do you notice about the bark? All right, what else do you notice? Great. So how do you guys, looking at all these plants in this area, how can you tell this plant apart from all the other plants? Are there any like unique features of this plant? Oh, interesting. Okay. Oh, yes. All right. So it's been a minute and a half. Your first pair of students are coming. So when your first pair of students arrive, the first thing you're going to do is introduce your plant. So what's your plant's name? Douglas fir, correct, good. Okay, so introduce your plant. Then ask your students what they notice. Can you practice saying, what do you notice? Good, good. And can you practice saying, what else do you notice? Good, all right. Then you're going to encourage your students to touch the plant. Use their senses, their sense of touch, their eyes to observe the plant. And at the very end, you're going to share with them how you tell this plant apart from other plants in the forest, or you can share a fun fact about this plant. And if you have fun facts to share about plants, you can. You don't need to share a fun fact. The students might also have a fun fact. Okay, taking off my t-shirt. So that's kind of how when I get a pair of students, that's how I introduce their plant. You have to be pretty quick because you only have a minute and a half. So your goal is to actually teach your students about their plant and to teach them how to teach about their plant. Don't forget to hand them the card because that's going to help them know to plant with their plant and not move because now they're teachers. Okay, we're almost done with this. So these are just some sort of extra tips and tricks that I've learned from leading this lesson many, many times. Definitely train your extra adult ahead of time. Their understanding is really crucial. The students don't really need to understand the pattern. They'll pick it up very quickly, but you and your supporting adult need to understand how it works. Your extra adult should use a loud sound maker if it's too quiet and the students can't hear that they're supposed to walk down the trail. You're going to get like clumping happening. So there should only be 4 students at a plant at a time. And if clumping starts to happen, it very quickly devolves. So loud sound maker. I like a cowbell or a recorder, but your extra adult should really make it loud. You want to keep your intro with the students, at the very beginning when you have the whole group before you've started walking down the path. You want to keep this really brief. So like 1 to 2 minutes. Don't explain the activity to students. It's a waste of time because they probably won't get it anyway. Just tell them that during this activity, they get to be a teacher and a student in order to learn native plants, and ask them to remember 2 things. The first is, if you have a card, you are a teacher and you stay with your plant. If you don't have a card, when you hear the bell, walk to the next plant. So if they can remember those 2 things and you and your supporting adult understand how the activity works, it will work out and the students will quickly learn the pattern just from doing it. So another tip, which I mentioned before, is once your extra adult has released all the students and they're standing alone at the beginning of the trail, it really helps to change to just 1 minute between bells. And this works really well for like a 50-minute or 1 hour class period. If you've got, an hour and a half, you've got tons more time with this. You can make your intro longer. You can do 2 minutes in between plants. You can get all the way through the line. So take 2 hours if you've got it. But you can do this in a 50-minute class period, and changing to 1 minute between bells, so that they just learn about, one plant for 1 minute works really well. So another just kind of fun tip is at the end of this lesson and throughout the whole curriculum, actually, you can reinforce plant names through a really fun chanting. So what I like to say is I'll say, and this can be to get their attention in a closing circle at the end of this lesson, and it can be back in the classroom and, throughout the unit. So you can say, when I say Douglas, you say fir. Then the teacher says Douglas, and the students say fir. Or as teacher, you could say, when I say big leaf, you say maple. You say big leaf, and the students say maple. And it's a really fun chant that actually really does a great job reinforcing these plant names. Moving right along, we are at lesson 4, the plant biodiversity investigation. So groups are going to collect data on the diversity of plants found in their restoration practice plot and a reference plot in the reference ecosystem in order to determine that the restoration plot has a lower diversity of plants than the reference plot. So this is another, like lesson 3, this is another foundational important lesson. And it's also a lesson that does take more prep. So I'm going to walk you through, do another kind of deep dive into this lesson so I can really hopefully set you up for success. So these 2 pictures kind of show a lot. We've got an example of what a reference ecosystem or reference site might look like. And obviously your restoration site might not look like that. This is just an example. But you're going to be setting up plots. And in this unit, your students, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but it's in the teacher guide. You're going to have students in groups of 4, and they're going to work in that group of 4 for the duration of the unit. And each group of 4 is going to have their own plot, practice plot, both in the reference ecosystem and the restoration site. Now, if you have multiple classes, you don't need a plot for each group of 4. They can share plots across classes, right? So if you have 200 students, you don't need 50 plots, so that each group of 4 has their own plot. You just need however many plots there are for one class. So if you have, 30 students in a class in groups of 4, then you would have, about 7 plots set up. Okay, so let's talk about setting up these plots. You want to set up enough plots so that each group of 4 has their own plot, like I said, in the restoration site and the reference ecosystem. The reference ecosystem, this is likely the same area where you did the Each to Teach You To, the plant ID lesson. Plots should be the same size. Now, you don't need to spend time like measuring it out with measuring tape, but they should be roughly the same size. And your reference plots should have a diversity of native plants, and your restoration plots should have low or no diversity of plants. So when you're setting up your restoration plots, if your restoration site has an area that actually does have some diversity of plants, just avoid that area for the restoration plots, because students are going to gather data on the type and variety and abundance of plants in each plot. And the goal with this investigation is that they see that there's a higher diversity of plants, native plants, in the reference plot than the restoration plot. So you want to kind of do everything you can to set them up for that discovery. And for your reference plots, again, try to encompass as many natives as you can. So, and again, it should be in your reference ecosystem where you did Each to Teach To. So the materials that you use to set up these plots is flexible. Use what you've got. I've set up these plots before using just sort of landscape flags with little metal, they're made of metal and you can just stick them in the ground really easily. And I'll set up 4 flags to mark the corners of the plot. Really helpful if you have some twine or some yarn, ideally brightly colored, but use what you've got to kind of tie between the flags to mark the border of the plot. But you don't have to use these materials. If you have garden stakes, wooden stakes and a hammer to hammer them in, that works. Use whatever you have on hand to make these plots. Hopefully you don't have to buy anything. And the size of these plots, is flexible. I would say that set up the plots in the reference ecosystem first, because you want to create plot sizes that are big enough to encompass, at least 4 natives. 3 was pushing it, but at least 4, ideally more species of native. So not just one kind of native, but 4 species of native, and ideally more than 4. But you don't want the reference plots to be so big that students aren't going to be able to count up all the plants in the plot in, your 50-minute science period. So you can make that judgment yourself. I've done plots that are 5 feet by 5 feet before, 10 feet by 10 feet. So you can kind of make that call. But once you've set up those reference plots, just have the plots in your restoration site be roughly the same size. So again, now that I've kind of gone through that preparation, lesson 4, I'll just remind you that lesson 4, it's a plant biodiversity investigation, and it really is going to set up the students for the rest of the unit. It's a super fun outdoor investigation. And this lesson is a really good way for students to practice the native plant ID that they learned in lesson 3. And it's also really great if you can help groups identify plants, because it's possible there will be some plants in their reference plots that they did not learn in Each to Teach To, or that they forgot. So if you can be available to go around to groups and help them with the plant identification, that's really helpful. If you yourself are learning plant identification, perhaps invite your volunteer expert partner to be present on this day to help with the plant identification. Another option is you can have a smartphone with you and use a free plant ID app. There's plenty of free plant ID apps where you just snap a photo and it tells you what plant you're looking at. So you can kind of walk around and help students identify, using your plant ID app. Or if you allow students to use technology, you could designate, one of the group members to have a phone that they could use to identify any plants in their plot that they don't know. If there are plants that you don't know and you're having a hard time identifying with a plant idea, it's okay for students to make up a name. They can be like spiky pointy plant, you know, a name that refers to some characteristic. The goal here is just that they see that there's a diversity of plants in the reference plots and a very low diversity or no diversity in the restoration plots. So this is a great lesson. But I want to talk about these practice plots for a minute. So we talked about the practice plot in the restoration site and the reference ecosystem that you use in lesson 4. But there's also a template that you will print out. It's in the unit folder, and each group of 4 students will get a set of 3 templates. One template that they will show what their practice plot in their restoration site looks like before restoration, one that shows during restoration, and one that shows after restoration. So each group of 4 gets 3 printed practice plot model templates. It's in the unit folder. And they're going to practice designing a restoration plan using this practice plot. They're not necessarily going to carry out their plan that they make for their practice plot in the restoration site. I don't necessarily recommend that you do that. It's really hard on planting day to have students be like, no, I'm going to plant this one. And I'm like, it's a bit much to manage. So I don't necessarily recommend that you actually have students carry out these are practice plots. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to lesson 5. And again, we're going to kind of breeze through the rest of these. So lesson 5 is categorization in an ecosystem. So groups categorize the ecosystem cards, that card set that you create and customize for your bioregion. They're going to organize those cards to find out that ecosystems are made of abiotic and biotic things, producers, consumers, and decomposers, and that plants can be classified as native, non-native, or invasive. And this is again, all the investigations, all the activities have step-by-step instructions for the students to follow in their notebook. And so they're following those steps to complete this activity. And again, this frees you up to be a guide on the side, to go rotate between groups and offer support, ask questions to get them to think deeper, clarify any misunderstanding. So these activities and investigations are pretty self-directed, because of the written handout in their notebook. Okay, lesson 6. So you only need to do lesson 6 if you have an invasive or an invasive species in your restoration site. If you do not have an invasive species in your restoration site, if you're doing lawn or pavement, or it's just bare soil or gravel, then you can just skip lesson 6. If you have lawn, if you want, you can kind of consider lawn to be an invasive species and still do this lesson, but it's really up to you. You only really need to do this lesson if there's an invasive species such as Himalayan blackberry, English ivy, or kudzu, or all the invasive vegetation we have in this country in your restoration site. So during this, groups make visual models to find out that invasive plants can decrease diversity of native plants in an ecosystem in order to make a plan for what to do about the invasive plants found in their restoration site. And again, if there are no invasives in your restoration site, just skip lesson 6, except for part 1 in lesson 6. And please do, I made a big note at the top. Part 1, students do make a model using the template I just showed you. So this one, before restoration, part 1 of lesson 6, they just make a simple model of their restoration site. Before any restoration, it takes about 10 minutes, and you kind of talk about models. So do part 1 of lesson 6, even if you don't have invasives, but then you can skip the rest of it if you don't have invasives. Okay, lesson 7 is planting design. So groups are going to actually go outside for about 10 minutes and make observations of the abiotic conditions of their practice plot in their restoration site in order to choose plants for their practice plot based on the abiotic needs of the available plants and the abiotic conditions of their practice plot. So this is really simple. The handout in the notebook really helps students, guides them in making these observations, but they just determine whether the practice plot gets full sun, partial sun, or if it's shade. And then they do a very simple test by holding a clump of soil and determining if it's what kind of dry or moist soil. And so again, you're going to want to leave those restoration plots that you set up for lesson 4, leave those plots set up because you'll need them for lesson 7. And then they're going to use the information on the back of the producer cards that you created for the ecosystem card set to determine, to choose plants for their practice plot. And see here they're showing, in their practice plot, and this corresponds to the actual practice plot in the restoration site, they're showing using the cards, they're going to glue them on to show, or actually not glue, tape them on to come up with a planting plan. Okay, so lesson 8 is pretty simple. The groups just find out the basics of matter and energy by doing a reading in order to be able to trace matter and energy through the ecosystem in following lessons. So this lesson is just an introduction or review to matter and energy. Okay, lesson 9. This is an important lesson. This is one of the meatiest lessons. This is where they're starting to really get to the answer to their challenge. So groups are going to develop 2 models of a food web in their practice plot, one before and one after restoration. And they're going to compare and contrast their food web models to discover that diverse native plant communities support a complex food web. So they're actually going to glue these cards from the ecosystem card set that each group has, and you've printed out in color. They're going to glue these onto their model templates for their practice plot. So this shows a food web in their practice plot before restoration. So if your restoration site is gravel, this would just be gravel and there would literally be no food web, right? Because no animals eat gravel. But if your restoration site is something like lawn or an invasive vegetation, like English ivy or blackberry, there are some animals that eat that. And so they will show that there are a few animals that can, there is a very simple food web before restoration. But here's the meat. So the students, each group creates a food web model in their practice plot after restoration. So you can see here, I'm going to go back here for a minute. You can see that they've taken these 4 plants that were in their during restoration, right? They chose these 4 plants for their practice plot and they taped them on here in their during restoration template. And now they taped them because they need to move them and glue them into a line at the bottom of this template that's after restoration in order to show how those 4 plants support a food web. And how do they know which consumers eat the producers and which consumers eat which consumers? Well, that diet information is all on the back of each card that you created. So groups glue these cards onto the template and then they show arrows to show eating relationships and flow of matter and energy. Okay, so at this point, they've really pretty much answered the question, the driving question. They've figured out that if we plant native plants in our schoolyard, if we plant native plants in our practice plot, that's going to support a complex food web. And they show that through the food web model they create. But there's still some more things to learn. And that sort of ties in some of the other ecosystem standards. So they're really, they've got the meat of their answer now, but there's still some more things to investigate. So lesson 10 is a decomposer investigation. Groups do a leaf litter investigation in order to find out the role decomposers will play in their restoration site after restoration. So you're actually going to collect some leaf litter from your reference ecosystem or from a nearby ecosystem, bring it in. Each group gets it on a tray. They're going to sort through it, of course, using that guided worksheet in their notebook that is step by step. And they're going to explore the organisms in this leaf pile and eventually figure out the role that decomposers play in the food web and in their restoration site. This is a really fun lesson. And finally, during lesson 10, they add decomposers to their food web model. So here you can see bacteria, slugs, and mushrooms. And obviously these will be different depending on what kind of ecosystem you're restoring and where you are. And you make these cards in your ecosystem card set. Lesson 11 is all about mutually beneficial interactions, otherwise known as symbiosis. So groups do a jigsaw activity about mutually beneficial interactions in order to learn about how matter and energy is cycled between organisms, and they explore implications for the restoration site. So this is a really fun activity where your group of 4, they're going to split up for the lesson, and they're going to go to different stations around the room. They're going to learn about different types of mutually beneficial interactions, including pollination and animal seed dispersal and fungal plant relationships. And then they're going to come back to their group of 4 and share out and kind of fill out a table in their notebooks. Okay, we are close to being through the unit here. We're at lesson 12. So this is all about ecosystem population dynamics, which is also one of the standards, performance expectations for ecosystems. So groups are going to analyze a graph to find out how populations of organisms influence each other in their restoration site ecosystem. And they're going to find out that if you have more native plants, this supports a higher population of insects, which supports a higher population of birds. And if one population, such as native plants or birds, declines, then the predator that relies on that food source also declines. And there are 2 options for this lesson, and they are both printed in the teacher guide. So you can choose whichever one you like. The first one is kind of a more traditional graph analysis. It's a very solid lesson. The second one is your students will create a model of population dynamics by playing a really fun running game that requires being outdoors or in a place like a gymnasium. And it's a really fun game where students are modeling the relationship between populations of native plants, insects, and birds by actually taking on the role of being native plants, insects, and birds and chasing each other around and acting out predation. It's a super fun lesson. I've described it in detail in that option 2 for lesson 12 in the teacher guide. But it takes much more setup, and it takes some practice facilitating it well as a teacher. And it can feel pretty wild and chaotic when kids are running around. So you might consider doing option 1 for lesson 12 the first year, and maybe the second year you try the running game with students. Or maybe you're really brave and you just jump right into the fun running game that is a model of population dynamics. Okay. By the end of the unit, students figure out that native plant communities form the foundation of complex food webs. I know I've said that many times. And here is their example of a food web model. Obviously, again, these cards are the ecosystem cards, and you create your own ecosystem cards for your bioregion using the template and instructions I've provided. So students figure out that if we want to increase biodiversity of our schoolyard, we can plant native plants to restore a complex food web. And this is a final message. So this is in lesson 13 when they're ready to write their proposals. And it's a message from me as president of Symbiotic Schoolyard to students about what to include in their proposals. And hopefully these videos just kind of up the ante a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about these proposals briefly. So the students are going to put together their ecosystem restoration proposals, which include 2 practice plot models before and after restoration. The during restoration template, since they took the plant cards and moved them onto the after restoration, the during restoration doesn't really have anything. And and then a scientific explanation of how their proposal is a solution to the problem of biodiversity decline in their schoolyard using this worksheet found in their notebook. And, so this is what I recommend is that you have each student write their own scientific explanation. I would encourage you to have the students in a group collaborate and work on it together, but each student should actually write their own in their notebook. And for the practice plot models, since each group has collaborated on these models for the duration of the unit, they can turn those in as a group product. So how you grade this is really up to you, but one option would be to give a group grade for the practice plot models and then an individual grade for the scientific explanation, the written explanation. That's it. That's the end of the unit. So let's just talk really briefly about the restoration days. I'll just say the number and timing of the restoration days depend on your unique site and situation. This is really flexible. The one thing that's less flexible is you really want to start the unit about 6 weeks before planting day, because you want students to have a chance to, create that this food web, and write their proposals before they plant. But the other days is flexible. So I'll just give you an example of how it can be done. It doesn't have to be done this way, but at one Symbiotic school, the students filled 2 10 cubic meter dumpsters with invasive blackberry and ivy in early fall. They did this after lesson 6, which is the lesson where they learn about the effects of invasive species in the ecosystem. Restoration day 2 was later in the fall, and students planted native plants in their schoolyard at their restoration site, where in the same place where they had removed the invasive blackberry earlier in the fall. And restoration day 3 was weeding in spring. So they came back in the spring and they weeded out all those little blackberries that have popped up. But this is really flexible. For example, you might need to weed more than one day in the spring if you have invasives in your site. And we could have done this invasive Himalayan blackberry removal day, we could have done it right before planting day after the unit. So our planting day might take more than one day. It's really flexible. So I want to just talk briefly about running successful restoration days. So the first thing is, ideally, your volunteer expert partner is present on all restoration days to ensure quality work. The second is you definitely want to invite extra adults, parents, etc., to help supervise students. So working in small groups led by one adult works really well. And that adult can be responsible for their group of 3 or 4 students or more. And you want to train the adults on the restoration task ahead of time. So if you're planting, you want to give those adults a full demo and tutorial about how to plant a plant well. There is skill involved in planting plants, so that they can then teach their students. And then on top of that, you want to have your volunteer expert partner roving around and making sure that the quality is all good, because how a plant is planted can mean the difference between survival or not for that plant. Okay, so on restoration day, you have your trained adults and the students are coming out. I recommend that you do these restoration days just in your science period, whether that's 50 minutes or an hour. And I recommend that you start with an opening circle. Again, I do this throughout the unit. I really like to use that native plant chanting game. So I'll say, when I say salmon, you say berry. Salmon, berry, salmon, berry. It's a great way to get students' attention during this unit. And so you can ask students what their challenge is to start. You can say, hey, can someone remind us of this big challenge you got from Symbiotic Schoolyard? And hopefully a student will say, to increase biodiversity. And then you can explain what students will be doing today. For example, if they're planting, explain that they will be planting. It's up to you if you want to demo with your whole group of students how to plant, or if you want to have your adult leaders demo in smaller groups. Sometimes that works better. And then definitely go over any safety considerations, including proper tool use. And finally, it's the end of your hour and it's time for closing circles. So you circle everyone up. And this is another great chance to connect to the unit. So you can ask your students, how did your work today help increase the biodiversity of your schoolyard? And hopefully they will talk about food webs, and it's a really great way to help them make that bridge between the work they're doing and what they learned in the classroom. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our second training video. I hope that was helpful. I am really happy to support you in any way. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I really do enjoy supporting Symbiotic Schoolyard teachers however I can. And I have supported teachers in doing this at many different diverse schools. So I bring many years of experience. Okay, best of luck and thank you.